Our next presentation is our Chapter 4 Insider, and it's a really big honor for me. I've been following the work of Mr. Healy and EnerNOC since I got into the field, actually, graduating college. So this is a great day for me. Mr. Healy co-founded EnerNOC in 2001 and serves as its chairman and CEO. In 2007, he led EnerNOC's initial public offering, which was named IPO of the Year by the Association for Corporate Growth, Boston and Mass High Tech, and received the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award in New England. More recently, EnerNOC was recognized with the 2012 Platts Global Energy Award for Industry Leadership, and Mr. Healy was honored as CEO of the Year by the Massachusetts Technology Leadership Council. Today, EnerNOC is one of the world's leading energy intelligence software providers, conducting business in over 100 countries with a team of more than 1,000 employees. Prior to EnerNOC, Tim worked in the Energy Technology Laboratory for Northern Power Systems, held positions with Merrill Lynch International Fuel Cells, now UTC Fuel Cells, and venture capital firm Commonwealth Capital Ventures. He also co-founded Student Advantage, a Boston-based affinity marketing company that went public in 1999. Tim currently sits on the board of directors at the Advanced Energy Economy, AEE, the New England Clean Energy Council, the Massachusetts High Technology Council, Genability Inc., and Zpryme, and he serves on TechNet's executive committee and the board of trustees for the New England Aquarium. Tim's an advisor to several area startups, and he coaches youth soccer. That's a good call. I'm a big fan. I'm an ASO kid, so yeah. So Tim graduated from Dartmouth College with a BA in Government and Economics and received his MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Without further ado, everyone, Tim Healy.
Thank you for that. That was kind. Thank you. All right. Well, good morning to everybody. I'm glad to be here this morning. That was a very kind introduction, and I think what's interesting is there's something on there that has to change because one of those companies no longer exists. It's been sold a couple times, which is the company my dad used to work for, which is sort of an interesting start to this morning's conversation, which is, in fact, I'll leave this up for a second. I got into this industry, as was mentioned, about 14 years ago, and I got into it in part because of a conversation that I was having with my father at the time. My father had worked for International Fuel Cells. That's how I had that on my resume as well, because it's nice when your father can get you a job when you're in college looking for that summer internship. But I worked for International Fuel Cells, which became UTC Fuel Cells, which a couple of years ago became defunct. It's no longer, I think its assets sold off to somewhere else, so not a company that exists anymore. And it's interesting because it was a great company at its time. It did some phenomenal things, but it was probably a little ahead of its time in some respects. And that was what my father tried to tell me when I got into the business about 14 years ago. I told him, look, I want to take this MBA education I have, or I'm about to have, and I want to start selling products to utilities. And he said, oh, geez, Tim, really? Do you want to do that? And the reason he said that is he said, I've been doing that for years, trying to sell new distributed energy resources in the form of fuel cells to utilities. And there are a lot of complexities and a lot of challenges associated with the utility business model and associated with how utilities deal with new opportunities, how utilities interact with change and innovation. And I said, yeah, but there's change coming. I can see it. I can see it in the form of deregulation. I can see it in the form of distributed energy resources, which at the time, if people remember back that far, there were probably a dozen freshly minted, publicly traded companies like Ballard Power and Astro Power and Plug Power and a whole bunch of companies. And the vision there was that we were starting to see a new paradigm in the electricity marketplace and the utility business model, where we were going to move from a centralized system to a system of distributed energy resources, much like mainframe computing moved to personal computing and distributed computing and now network computing. we were going to see the same thing happen in the industry. And I wanted to be in at the very cutting edge as that was getting going. And I have to say that it was a little bit slower to develop than I thought. And I say that even though EnerNOC was very fortunate. I think we had a little bit of luck on our sides, and EnerNOC was able to go from basically concept, raise a little bit of money in 2003, and within 5 years of graduating from business school, David Brewster and I took EnerNOC public, as was just mentioned. So we were doing a few things right, and things were happening in the industry, but never before, okay, and I've been at this for 14 years, never before have I seen the pace of change as dramatic as it is today. And I can't put my finger on exactly when that paradigm shift started to occur, but I can tell you it's within the last 12 to 24 months, and maybe even more recently, we're seeing change happen in a pretty dramatic fashion in the electric utility industry and on our grid. And I want to give a few comments and a few observations and a few, hopefully some key thoughts on what that means for all of us in this room, what it means for the industry. So let me put up the first slide and paint a picture. I think this change is characterized first and foremost by the paradigm shift in customer behavior. And that paradigm shift is, first and foremost, it's about customer choice. It used to be that there really weren't a whole lot of things for customers to choose when it came to energy. A large commercial customer would build a new store, a new factory, a new plant, a new facility, and it would call up its utility, and the utility would say, this is the rate that you qualify for, it's your industrial rate, it's your commercial rate, this is the tariff, this is what you're going to pay. We'll assign you a key account rep so that you guys can get to know one another. Hopefully you get some good time at the golf course together, and here we go. Well, today, change or choice is what characterized the industry more so than ever. That same customer now has, in many markets, a choice of utility provider, certainly a choice of supplier provider. They can choose to put some sort of distributed energy resource into their facility. They're thinking about solar. They're thinking about how batteries play a role. You suddenly have CFOs at these large organizations who are having to sign purchase orders for tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in capital equipment that's being put on site. And oftentimes these are long-term agreements, some of the longest term agreements that any CFO will sign, 20-year power purchase agreements for a PV system, or some sort of a PV system integrated with storage or integrated with an information layer of software, and there's a need for a lot more decision making because there's a lot more choice that customers have. And this goes all the way down to the residential level where customers are facing that same choice. Someone is knocking on the door, talking about putting solar on the roof, talking about reducing their electricity bill, talking about buying renewable energy as part of the portfolio of choices that these customers have. Well, that choice is leading to some pretty interesting dynamics. Number one, it's leading to more efficiency, and it's leading to a reduction in the overall energy consumption, or certainly a reduction in revenues for utilities. And this stat that I have up here, this 50% decline that you see, relates to the fact that, first and foremost, 70% of utilities today project that they have stagnant load growth forecasted over the next several years. 10% of utilities expect to have a decline in load growth over the next several years. That, combined with the fact that customers are becoming more energy efficient, combined with the fact that utilities' business models are changing, is leading to things like we've seen in Europe, where we've seen a 50% reduction since 2008. Just the last 7 years, we've seen a 50% reduction in the market caps, the enterprise values of the 20 largest energy companies, utilities in Europe. In 7 years, a 50% decline. The market caps of those companies used to be $1.3 trillion, and they've lost over half of $1 trillion of market cap, more than $500 billion worth of market cap. Significant change happening in the industry as a result of all this choice. Not surprisingly, we're seeing some reactions to that. And I think one of the things that caught the attention of a number of us in the industry was when one of Europe's largest utilities announced that it was basically splitting itself into two, and it was going to focus a lot of its managerial effort and a lot of its resources on becoming a customer solutions utility, and that utility is E.ON over in Europe. So dramatic change happening, and it's characterized by choice. So changes are ahead. The challenge here is that change is hard. Change is not easy. I can attest to that because our company itself is having to undergo change associated with growing pains, change associated with more dynamic activity happening in the industry, and going from being ourselves a provider of one type of solution to a broader platform of solutions for customers. And that means that our organization, which is now a 1,300-person organization, is having to go through change. Well, there's a whole industry of change happening, and this is hard for utilities. It's particularly hard for utilities to change because of the reality of the way they operate, the reality of the regulatory constructs that they operate in. Complexity is hard in and of itself. It's hard because our grid is one of the most complex engineering marvels of the last century. In fact, I think there were a number of different things that indicated that it was one of man's greatest achievements in the last century was the building of our electricity grid. And so if we're talking about one of the most complex infrastructure systems that is now undergoing dramatic change, you can imagine that the complexity of that and the challenge of that is going to be enormously hard. You combine that with the fact that there is a very unique regulatory construct that exists in this industry. And the regulatory construct that exists in this industry is unlike a lot of others in that in this industry, the primary players, utilities, historically have made more money for their shareholders, made more money, more profits, the more they increase costs, which is just, and I know that's an oversimplification for any utilities in the room that want to debate whether that's the essence of the utility model. I can understand that there's debate on that, but when you think about it, a utilities business construct is that they want to spend capital because if they increase their capital expenditures, they can rate base their CapEx expenditures, and that increase in rate base allows them to make more profits for their shareholders, which is, at the end of the day, that is one of the primary objectives of any organization that is in the for-profit arena, which utilities are. So you have a really complex regulatory arena, and I would proffer that we are not in a period anymore of incremental change. I think we're in a period of revolutionary change. And what I mean by that is incremental change, that's interesting, new things happen. But moving from, let's say, the horse-drawn buggy to the automobile, that was revolutionary change. And I think right now that we are seeing utilities facing revolutionary change. When you see utilities that are declining their market cap by 50% in a period of 7 years, and that industry has been a stable industry for the last 100 years, you're talking about an industry that is undergoing revolutionary rather than incremental change. I would argue that the record and recording and content industry about a decade or more ago underwent the same type of revolutionary change. You think about how we used to consume our content, in particular music and movies, and we're seeing that that went through revolutionary change, and you saw that there were some players that embraced that change, some that didn't. But today, we consume how we purchase our music content a lot differently than we did 10 years ago. Revolutionary change as opposed to incremental change. I would say that that revolutionary change means that there are going to be new things that we haven't even imagined yet that are going to occur in the way we think about, interact with, consume our energy. I heard one of the most interesting things, or it was interesting in the context it was provided, and that was from a telecom executive. And the telecom executive said, if you go back in time to the 1960s and 70s, where in every home in America, in every home in any developed country, you had a big hunking, phone that was screwed onto the wall. It came in, orange and yellow and all sorts of colors of the 60s and 70s. And it had a long cord attached to it, and that phone was attached to the wall. And if you told folks that there was going to be a day where they would be walking around with a telephone and be making phone calls while they were driving, making phone calls while they were in the middle of a restaurant having dinner, or making the type of telecommunications change that had occurred, people would have looked at you and said, that's crazy. Why would I want to walk around with that thing that I hang on the wall? That's big and bulky, and what need do I have? If people want to call me, they'll call me when I'm at home, and I'll make my phone calls at home. And the argument there is, I think there are things that we haven't even imagined yet that we're going to do with electricity that has to do with the intersection of energy and mobile, the intersection of energy and social, the intersection of a number of these things that are probably difficult for us to imagine today, the same way it would have been 30 or 40 or 45 years ago if we thought about the fact that our paradigm and our mindset at that point in time was a connected wire to a wall, back to wires that connected, and we couldn't imagine why we would even want some of these things, and we couldn't imagine the value that they would provide to us. And I think that's the type of change that we're seeing. This 76% stat, well, one of the changes with this is that utilities have decided we got to do something about this, and particularly US utilities. They're watching what occurred in Europe. They don't want to see the same thing happen here. They know that some of the dynamics of that change that occurred in Europe that decreased the top 20 energy companies by 50% or more of their market cap was due in large part to some policies that Europe was a little bit further ahead on, and some initiatives there. And so what are utilities doing? Well, first and foremost, they're investing in their customers, plain and simple. 76% of utilities have mentioned that they are investing, plan to invest, or already have invested in customer engagement. And I caught the tail end of the last presentation. I heard that concept mentioned, and I think that's going to be a big concept for the next 3 to 5 years. Customers getting engaged because of the fact that it is such a more dynamic part of the industry than it ever has been. There's another thing to keep in mind. Utilities have to make this change, and the reason they have to make this change is because of the way the utilities business models are constructed. There are a few other industries, and there are some, but there are a few other industries that are so capital intensive and that have a fixed cost structure which is so immovable relative to incremental changes in the demand for their products. And what I mean by that is that I've seen studies recently in the last 12 months that have come out that say just a 1 to 2.5% reduction in demand for electricity can have anywhere from a 4 to, in some cases, 10% reduction in a utility's profit. So a minor move in the amount of demand has a compounding or exponential effect on a utility's profits. I've also seen statistics that suggest that we're going to see about 10% demand growth or demand shrinking happening for utilities, and that 10% could result in anywhere from up to 41% decrease in a utility's profits if we see the type of penetration of PV, energy efficiency, battery storage, and so forth. Massive, massive amount of profitability destruction that utilities are headed for. And so with that type of reverse leverage in a utility's operating model, they need to do something, and one of the things that they're doing is investing on the demand side of the equation. I'll give you another interesting tidbit. Over the last 5 days, I've met with 2 utility executives in various parts of the country. One was in the Southeast, and another one was in the Northwest. And one of them said to me, I grew up on the supply side of the utility. That's where you wanted to work if you were in a utility. You wanted to work on the supply side. And that utility exec recently took a position as an SVP in customer operations and customer solutions. And he said, some of his colleagues said, well, what'd you do wrong to get put in that side of the house? And he replied back, I didn't. I know that over the next 5 to 10 years, this is where you want to be if you want to move your career forward, because this is where all the action is going to be now. Now, he acknowledged that's not easy for a utility. That's not easy for a utility whose culture has been about engineering these complex supply-side activities. It's not easy for their vernacular. It's not easy for them to change when their vernacular has been about meters and ratepayers rather than about customers and people and individuals and companies that buy their product. And so I think what we're seeing, though, is that the top utilities recognize that this is where the action is. I'll save the other anecdote for later. Engaging customers pays off. Connecting customers, as I mentioned, it used to be about supply and demand. It used to be about the supply side versus the demand side. I don't think that that's going to be the characterization of our electricity grid in the future, in part because of this new term that is being used in the vernacular today, which is that you no longer have a one-way flow on the system. You actually have a two-way flow on our electricity grid. And what that means is that customers aren't just consuming energy anymore. The customer side is no longer just load. The customer side is actually supply as well. In other words, customers, because of the production of PV, batteries, electric cars that have electric batteries that can pump power back into the electric grid, demand response, and an increase in the energy efficiency activity of customers where they have smart appliances that can shut off and do things on their own automatically or in response to price signals. You now have a much more dynamic two-way system. And one of the words that's being tossed around is this idea of a prosumer. It used to be there were either producers or consumers, supply and demand. Fascinating part of any economist's life would be to study the purity of the electric system in order to understand supply and demand behavior. Well, sorry, economic professors, but we're going to muddy it up for you over the next decade or so, because it's no longer as simple as I am just a consumer and I can choose not to consume. It's that I am sometimes a consumer and now I'm sometimes a producer. I'm a prosumer. And I think that that's one of the interesting things that we're seeing in today's electricity market is the challenge that that creates for the electric utility. But the electric utilities get it. They understand it. Energy companies are starting to make significant investments on this side of the table. And I'm starting to hear terms that I haven't heard from certain utility execs. Utility execs are starting to become customer focused. And I even heard a utility exec, a woman from Green Mountain, who mentioned their need at their utility in a recent article in the New Yorker, who said that she's espousing that her employees become customer obsessed. What I find really interesting about that is basically utilities are selling a commodity product. And so you'd say, well, come on, that's hard. How can I do anything if it's such a commoditized product? What can I do to differentiate? Well, think about some of the other commodity products out there and what the best companies are in the commodity products. I would argue that a lot of retail, a lot of selling us the goods that we buy at retail is very much a commodity activity. I can go to Walmart and buy some. I can go to the little store on Main Street and I can buy probably the same product, same SKU from the same manufacturer. I can buy it online from a number of e-commerce retailers. I've got a lot of choice. I can buy it from a lot of places. Well, if over and over again, the most customer-obsessed company in the marketplace by a lot of measures is Amazon. Think of what Jeff Bezos has done over the past decade and a half or two. He's reputed to hold meetings where he has an extra chair at the meetings, an empty chair at his executive meetings and his staff meetings. And that empty chair is, he's told his employees or his staff or his executive team to think of the customer is who's sitting in that chair. That's how customer obsessed we need to be, that when we conduct meetings, planning meetings, we're thinking about the customer. They have a seat at our table and we are customer obsessed. Well, he's in a business that is very much a commodity business, but they decided that they're going to win by focusing on customer engagement and providing the best experience for the customer possible. Think about the airline industry. The airline industry, very commoditized, capital-intensive industry. What's been one of the most successful airlines? Southwest Airlines. And when you think about what they've said about themselves, there's an old saying that when you read about Southwest, they say, well, we're in the customer service business and we just happen to fly airplanes. That's how they think of themselves. That's the mentality that they've adopted in a very commoditized part of the market. And I think utilities need to embrace this same type of attitude, becoming customer obsessed and thinking about how they can be the best at moving from an infrastructure-based part of the value equation to a customer-based part of the value equation. And this will pay off. A number of studies that I'll cite. The first one is an HBR study that talked about the increasing value, the increasing enterprise value according to your customer base relative to the decreasing enterprise value associated with some of your other assets like infrastructure, and in this particular study, brand and trademarks and other things like that. The better you are with your customers, the more customers you have, and the better you are at engaging those customers, there's a correlation to an increase in your market cap, whereas your brand and your reputation, those are important things, but they are a decreasing component of that correlation. Another one is from PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, that indicates that more engaged customers has a direct correlation in a recent study that they did earlier this year or late last year with an increase in revenues. And that's exactly what the utilities are trying to do, is to stave off this decrease in revenue. So a couple of interesting studies there. The second one from PwC, the first one from Harvard Business Review. It's all about channels of choice. It's about connecting with customers. It's about creating intelligent automation so that customers can do more than just sit back and have change happen to them without any information or knowledge about what's going on. So I think in the 1 minute I have left, I think the grid of the future is characterized as this superhighway of information to enable this new customer choice and this new dynamic interaction that utilities can have with their customers in a changing environment that I'm excited is finally upon us, because I think there are a number of companies that are poised to help utilities and help customers navigate this change, navigate this opportunity. Companies like EnerNOC and others in our ilk are out there trying to create solutions to help utilities engage with their customers, help them understand when they have a high bill alert, help them understand these moments that matter in their engagement with their utilities, help them understand where they're spending money, what their risks are, what changes are ahead, and how those changes are going to affect budget, how they're going to affect the product life cycles or the businesses that they're in, what changes are ahead, and how the utility can be there to help them navigate that. Just helping the business understand what their role is in keeping our electricity grid humming, keeping supply and demand in balance, making sure that they have knowledge about when the grid is at its most vulnerable point so that customers can take action if they need to reduce their energy consumption at peak times to help the utilities navigate that supply and demand balance, that delicate balance, and continue to operate one of the most complex systems in the world that is becoming even more complex. So with that, I look forward to talking about this in more depth with the panelists that we have in the next session, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about it from our perspective as well. Thank you. Do it on the panel. I mean, either's fine.
You know, just a quick question, just because this slide is so good for it. You know, smart means different things to different people, but especially, and I'm seeing this a lot in Texas in the oil and gas industry, information isn't enough, intelligence is where they expect everything to be.
Yeah.
Can you sort of talk about EnerNOC, how they migrate from, you know, here's this great repository of this information. Here's this tool now, though, that is really much more sophisticated in terms of intelligence that's actionable. Can you differentiate her in how you migrate as a software provider for all those actors in the space?
Well, there's a number of things in that question. You're absolutely right, and it strikes me, we have EnerNOC has a customer advisory board, we have a utility customer advisory board, and the theme that we keep hearing over and over again is, I don't need help with aggregating the data or having the data or getting access to the data. I need help making sense of what this data means to me and how it's going to affect decisions that I can make. And we hear the same thing from our commercial, industrial, and institutional customers, that they're looking for actionable insights. And you know, one of the challenges that I think the energy intelligence software industry faces is that customers have to transform their business. They need to be led to understand the art of the possible. And in many respects, that means that companies that are in the big data business, like EnerNOC, need to do more than just make the data available. We need to turn it into actionable insights. We need to create easy to use, simple to use tools that create some of the automation and some of that insights for customers. Simple things, you know, accruing the pain that exists in the fact that utilities don't send us our bill until 30 or 60 days after the period has happened, and companies are sitting there not knowing how much they spent on energy in that last period, and they don't have any means to accrue and understand whether they were on budget or off budget. So giving them the tools to help understand what that is, taking them through and giving them very easy to use automated wizards and templates so that they can run the type of analytics to understand what are best practices in the industry, benchmark me against others, use the data that we have to give more solutions to these customers. And I think there's a wealth of new opportunities on that frontier, and we're going to see things that we hadn't even thought of at this point in time.
I appreciate it. I know we weren't supposed to do a Q&A on that, but
Yeah.
that was just, I thought that really was a good juxtaposition with what you were providing there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.